Shalom, shalom, Israel. It's your brother Benaiah Ben Israel, coming to you with a Black history lesson regarding the tragic murder of Mrs. Martin Luther King Sr. By the hand of a Black Hebrew Israelite? You see, family, over the years, the African Israelite community has had to bear the brunt of repeated attacks of slander, false accusations, and misinformation. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is without exception. You see, whether it be blatant lies levied by the Anti-Defamation League, or attacks from elements within the Ashkenazi community in general, antagonizers of Israel appear determined to take every opportunity to skew the truth and slander an African Israelite whenever the opportunity arises. Confused? Well, let me show you a few examples of the Anti-Defamation League caught red-handed lying against the African Israelite community.
With all that said, there's a range of practice and observance. So there are plenty of Black Jews who go to what you might call traditional Jewish synagogue. Then there are other communities like the Black Hebrew Israelites. Now, there's a range of practice even among Black Hebrew Israelites. You know, there's a large community of them in Israel who identify as Jewish in a traditional way. And then you have the guys in Times Square who observe in a way that's not so traditional, I would say.
They would say y'all aren't Jews. It would say that, what they say, white people are not the original Jews, basically.
Correct.
Yeah.
And look, they're entitled to their beliefs until that justifies shooting Jewish people with pellet guns on Staten Island. Or like, this is December. 3 years ago, December 2019, two Black Hebrew Israelites went into a kosher supermarket in Jersey City and killed 3 people because they said they weren't real Jews.
Wow.
Shot them cold dead in a kosher supermarket.
There has been considerable reporting that these 2 suspects are linked to the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. We have evidence that both suspects expressed interest in this group, but we have not definitively established any formal links to that organization or to any other group. Based on the available evidence, we believe that the 2 shooters were acting on their own.
So when we talk about what is anti-Semitism, it's Black Hebrew Israelites this weekend. What, today's Monday? Tuesday.
Wednesday.
What's going to air on Wednesday?
Sorry. So it is over this past weekend in Staten Island on Sunday, a Jewish man who, he must have been Orthodox because you could identify that he was Jewish, and his son were shot by a young man with a pellet gun as they came out of a
guns. I did see that, yeah.
And so when he was asked by the police, they said it was a hate crime. He said, how could it be a hate crime if I'm a Hebrew?
And now for the truth. This is the picture of the man arrested and charged for the crime of which Jonathan Greenblatt implies was committed by a Black man, a Black Hebrew Israelite man. However, the person who committed the crime is called Jason Kish, which is a Jewish name, who is a white Caucasian male. You see, Jonathan Greenblatt's and the ADL's practice of making accusations against so-called Negroes goes back many, many years. In fact, the ADL was founded when the courts failed to convict a Black man instead of convicting Ashkenazi Jew Leo Frank. You see, family, the ADL appears to be hell-bent on portraying African Israelites as violent, rampaging monsters. This is done by making Black Hebrew Israelite connections to violent acts by any means necessary, even if the person suspected in the violent act hasn't associated with Israelite groups for over 4 years, leading up to the violent crime in question. You know what they say, once a Black Hebrew Israelite, always a Black Hebrew Israelite. As such was the case of the rampaging murderer David Anderson in the New Jersey shooting, who apparently visited a Black Hebrew Israelite congregation for a few months, 4 years before committing a heinous act of violence. You see, family, the ADL and the New York Times ignored the fact that David Anderson recently spent time in prison leading up to the murders, and ignored the associations and the lessons learned while incarcerated. Apparently, in their minds, a Black Hebrew Israelite congregation is more dangerous than prison itself.
Radical Hebrew Israelite ideology has already killed people.
2 suspects got out of their van and began firing at the JC Kosher supermarket in Jersey City.
4 shot to death in a Jersey City kosher grocery in 2019.
The suspect slashed his way through a house full of Orthodox Jewish worshippers.
5 people stabbed with a machete during a Hanukkah party 2 weeks later, and the movement is spreading.
This ongoing character assassination of the African Israelite community is a deadly game of pinned violence on a Black Hebrew. For example, the machete-wielding maniac referenced in the previous video was implied to be a Black Hebrew Israelite by the ADL and mainstream media simply because he wrote the words Hebrew Israelites, powerful people, Ebenoid Israelites on a sheet of paper. Never mind, he was a previously diagnosed schizophrenic with a history of hearing voices and later deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. So apparently, if you write the words Black Israelite on a sheet of paper, you're now considered a Black Hebrew Israelite? Or does stating that you're an Israelite of African descent, does that make you a Black Hebrew Israelite? And if that's the case, does that mean that all Muslims are Black Hebrew Israelites?
I asked the question, who are the real children of Israel? And I'd like to answer it right away.
Go ahead, Jim, minister.
Like any good lawyer in a courtroom,
Talk, man.
he tells you what he's going to prove.
All right.
And then he goes ahead and proves it and let the jury make the decision. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad has said that Almighty God, Allah, revealed to him that the Black people of America are the real children of Israel. And we are the choice of God.
That's right.
And that unto us he will deliver his promise.
That's right.
You see, this foolish game of slander isn't a new attack vector against the African Israelite community. In fact, we saw this very same attack used when the late great Mrs. Martin Luther King Sr. was assassinated by a mentally ill murderer named Janot. On Monday and Tuesday, June 24th and 25th, 1974. Janot was in Dayton, staying with Brooks and his girlfriend. His parents did not know that he was in town. Brooks said he and Janot talked about moving to California or Florida. We made plans to go looking for a house somewhere where it was warm. When I got my vacation in August, Brooks said. He said that on Wednesday, June 26, he drove Chenault back to his apartment in Columbus. And that was the last time he saw Chenault. At his Dayton home Friday night, his father said he looked normal. And Mrs. Chenault said she talked to her son about 5:30 p.m. from work. He said he wanted to use the car to go to a party, she said. I told him to be sure to turn out the lights before he left. Chenault checked into a Holiday Inn motel in downtown Dayton that evening and paid for a room for 2 nights. One hotel employee said he boasted while paying the bill, I don't need money in this Christian world. Chenault allegedly left room 813 there on Saturday for his fateful journey to Atlanta on a 6:25 p.m. Greyhound bus. He left the family car in the hotel parking lot, and police said he arrived in Atlanta at 7:45 a.m. and took a cab to Ebenezer Church, which was not open. He checked into an Atlanta Holiday Inn, and Chenault returned to the church 3 hours later, police said. The church has a custom of having visitors introduce themselves. Chenault introduced himself as Mr. Wynn from Kentucky. And shortly after 11 a.m., after asking someone to point out Mrs. King to him, police said he stood up and screamed, I'm tired of all this. I'm taking over. Mrs. King slumped to death at the keyboard of the organ, never finishing the Lord's Prayer. As the world mourned yet another tragedy, many were wondering why. Why would this young man commit such a heinous, evil, wicked act of violence against our beloved mother? And without hesitation, the Ashkenazi-owned New York Times provided the answer. It was a Black Hebrew Israelite. It was he who mentored and twisted and molded the young, impressionable, innocent young man into a hateful, murderous soul. And in the early days of July, newspapers around the world joined in on this obvious conclusion.
It was a Black Hebrew Israelite. 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 It was a Black Hebrew Israelite.
The articles published by the New York Times was head and shoulders above what was covered by other editorials. Whereas other editorials portrayed the so-called mentor of Chenault as a non-violent associate, the New York Times and other Ashkenazi newspapers, on the other hand, portrayed Chenault's previous associate as an evil, wicked mastermind, calling for the murder of pastors and deacons around the world. The following is an article by Ashkenazi David Sater, which reads, Chenault Act, God's Orders, by David Sater. The man who introduced accused slayer Marcus Chenault to Black Judaism says the slaying of Mrs. Martin Luther King Sr. in Atlanta Sunday may have been divinely inspired. Hananiah E. Israel, 68, who once was known as Stephen Hollyman, said he was Chenault's teacher in Judaism and that Chenault, whom his parents thought of as quiet and withdrawn, was his favorite and most zealous pupil. He said the chances that Chenault was acting on orders from God when he allegedly fatally shot Mrs. King and a church deacon looked pretty good. And the next reference reads, New York Times News Service. And it reads, Israel taught that blacks were a lost tribe of Israelites, enslaved by whites and misled by the Christian teachings of black ministers, that only the death of all black ministers would make blacks free. The New York Times' Paul Delaney claimed that the Black Hebrew Israelite boogeyman, Hananiah Israel, called for the death of all black ministers. However, Hanani Israel himself and other news publications exposed the New York Times article and Ashkenazi David Sater's article as a lie. As the following reference reads, although the self-styled mentor says he does not preach violence, he once wrote, when you stop these lying preachers from deceiving you and your loved ones, from robbing them of millions of dollars a year, you will have a better economy. He suggested no specific way to stop them, however. And the next reference reads, despite the harsh rhetoric, Israel insisted that he does not preach violence. As the Ashkenazi publications cast their net around 68-year-old Hanani Israel in early July, additional details of Chenault's background, character, and mental state began to surface. In the following weeks, a clear picture of the true root cause of Chenault's violent episode began to come into focus. Hints of this new truth surfaced during Chenault's trial. When Chenault was subdued at the scene of the crime, he stated, "The war made me do it." And he would then later say, God made him do it, or that he was given an assignment to carry out the murder from God, not from Hanani Israel. As the next reference reads, Bacchus said, Chenault's God is Yahweh, the Hebrew God of the Old Testament. He said it was his God that had sent him to Atlanta on a mission. And about Chenault belonging to the Black Hebrew Israelites, let's read what Chenault and his lawyer had to say about it. And it reads, additionally, the lawyer representing the suspected assassin of Mrs. King, the mother of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., says flatly that he does not belong to any group organized to punish black ministers. And the next reference reads, Chenault's attorney maintained that the youth was a loner. He asked Chenault to name any group, association, or organization that he attended, any meetings he attended. As a matter of fact, he was a loner. He said, I was alone. I thought alone. I read alone. I investigated alone. I acted alone. All the conclusions are his, without being modified by anyone else. The truth began to surface about a week after the initial New York Times article. Additionally, questions regarding Chenault's mental state began to come into focus as well. Before and during the trial, with Chenault's former friends and associates painting a picture of an unstable soul. As the following reference reads, we always thought he was a little weird as a freshman, remarked Carol Peters, who said she and a girlfriend used to eat lunch with Chenault soon after he came to Ohio State in 1969. He was loud and he would say weird things to get attention. He said he once killed some little kittens he had by flushing them down the toilet. Soon, we started avoiding him. More and more students began to avoid him when they found his conversation irrelevant, especially when he talked religion. And the next reference reads, at Ohio State, he became interested in the Hebrew Pentecostal Church of the Living God, made up of small congregations sprinkled across the country. The sect believes that blacks descended from a tribe of Israelites and were therefore black Hebrews, not Negroes. Chenault once told a student, the only way a little guy can get any attention is to go out and shoot someone. And the next reference reads, a neighbor in a building adjacent to Chenault's said that in the number of conversations she had with him, he was really incoherent. He really didn't make sense, sort of babbled. And the next reference reads, the neighbor Key Cheney, 23, a senior in the Ohio State School of Education, in which Chenault had been enrolled, although the school official said that he had not paid tuition since December and apparently had dropped out, also said she thought Chenault was sort of crazy, but completely harmless. And the next reference reads, Atlanta, Georgia, September 12th. A Superior Court jury convicted Marcus Wayne Chenault today of the murders last June of Mrs. Martin Luther King Sr. and a church deacon. Chenault, 23 years old, a black college student from Dayton, Ohio, clapped his hands and threw kisses to the jury. as each member was polled individually. And the next reference reads and reads, as one of his attorneys began a plea for mercy before the jury retiring again to fix the sentence, Chenault clutched the arms of his chair, stuck out his tongue, convulsed as though in the electric chair, and then slumped over. A few seconds later, he sat up, smiled, and made the V for victory sign. And the next reference reads and reads, Chenault has daily performed antics, such as giving a Nazi-like salute to the judge or witnesses, rocking with silent laughter, making faces, firing imaginary guns, or sticking his tongue out at the jury. And the next reference reads and reads, weeks before the incident, witnesses said that Marquis, which is Marcus Wayne Chenault, went through numerous personality changes. One day he was an anti-communist, the next day a Black Panther militant, one day he was a Christian, the next a Muslim or a Jew. One week he was chasing women, the next week he claimed to be homosexual. And the next reference reads and reads, Lori Tall, a freshman who once lived in Chenault's neighborhood, said his new religion was one half Black Muslim and one half Marcus, as in Marcus Garvey. You see, during the trial, Chenault was seen by two different psychiatrists, and both diagnosed Chenault as schizophrenic paranoia. As the following reference reads and reads, Dr. Lloyd Backus, assistant professor of psychiatry and director of the Law and Psychiatric Service for Grady Hospital, testified that between July 9th, 1974 and July 26, 1974, he examined the appellant 5 times for a total of 7 hours. He also interviewed the appellant's parents for approximately 4 hours. Dr. Backus diagnosed the appellant as having a schizophrenic mental condition, paranoid type. And the next reference reads and reads, Dr. Dewitt Clifton Alfred, chief psychiatrist at Grady Hospital and associate professor of psychiatry at Emory University, also testified in regard to the sanity of the appellant. Skipping ahead, the doctor classified the appellant as schizophrenic paranoid. And the next reference reads and reads, Chenault was sentenced to death, even though 2 psychiatrists testified that Chenault suffered from schizophrenia and was insane at the time of the murders. WebMD, what is paranoid schizophrenia? Paranoid schizophrenia, with paranoia as doctors now call it, is the most common example of this mental illness. Schizophrenia is a kind of psychosis, which means your mind doesn't agree with reality. It affects how you think and behave. And the next reference reads and reads, what are the symptoms? Schizophrenia typically happens in 3 stages. The active stage of schizophrenia is when the symptoms are at their worst. The key symptoms of schizophrenia are delusions, hallucinations, disorganized or incoherent speech, or as in babbling, as observed by his neighbor, disorganized or unusual behavior, as observed by his friends, and negative symptoms. Even though Chenault was diagnosed with schizophrenic paranoia, the doctors felt that he was sane enough to stand trial, arguing that Chenault knew right from wrong and wasn't forced to commit the crimes by his mental illness. Even though when asked why he committed the murder, Chenault replied, God sent him to do it. As the following reference reads and reads, after the judge pronounced sentence, Chenault addressed the court. My name is Servant Jacob. I was ordered here by my God, my Father, and my Master, Chenault said, grinning. At the conclusion of the trial, Chenault was sentenced to death while blowing kisses to the jury, and by an extraordinary act of grace by the King family. The King family lobbied for Chenault not to receive the death penalty. Instead, he received life in prison, where he remained in prison until he passed away in 1997. This unfortunate tragedy impacted many, many lives, across the country. Even to this very day, it is a source of great, great sorrow. And unfortunately, some have tried to use this tragic event to blame Black Hebrew Israelites, instead of stating the truth of this being a murder of a confirmed schizophrenic, paranoia, mentally ill person. And with that, family, hopefully this Black history lesson blessed you. And as always, thank you to those who continue to lift me and my family up in your thoughts and prayers. And also thank you to those who continue to support this platform through your donations. And please like, subscribe, and share. And with that, family, stay blessed, Israel, and shalom.